In this section, we're going to talk about what React.js actually is, why you would use it, and how it works. Alright, so React is an open source JavaScript library for building dynamic user interfaces, web user interfaces. And if you're familiar with the MVC design pattern, which is Model View Controller, you can think of React as the V or the view in MVC. Now, a lot of people get confused with React and think of it as something like AngularJS. Well, Angular it's a full web framework. It takes care of modeling data. It takes care of routing. It's pretty much a standalone framework that you don't need anything else. It's an out-of-the-box solution. React.js is a library, all right, and it only deals with the view or the user interface, all right. So they're not interchangeable, Angular and React. You can't really compare the two. I've even read some articles titled Angular versus React, which doesn't even make sense because they're not the same thing at all. All right, so React doesn't do as much as Angular, but it's excellent at what it does do, and that's building dynamic UIs. So React is used a lot in SPAs or single-page applications. It was created and is still maintained by Facebook, Instagram, and a large community of individual developers and corporations. So why would you use React? Well, of course, because it helps developers build large applications with dynamic data. All right, so React is simple in that at any given point in time, React automatically manages your UI and your UI updates whenever your underlying data changes. All right, so it does a lot by itself. Now, it's declarative because when it hits the refresh button internally, it only updates what needs to be updated as opposed to the entire application, which makes it really fast and efficient. All right, now it's composable because it's built on component-based JavaScript. So everything is encapsulated. You have a component for different areas of your app, and this makes your code reusable. It's easy to test, and it's easy to have multiple developers on one application. Compatibility. So React only handles the UI or the view, so it can be used in conjunction with other technologies, libraries, and MVC frameworks. All right, so React is not Angular, but you can use React with AngularJS. There's also a bunch of React-based add-ons to add functionality, and you can use it with things like frameworks like Ruby on Rails, as well as many other frameworks, libraries, and technologies. All right, so one of the great things about React is that we can do data binding. Okay, so by default, React utilizes a one-way reactive data flow. And this makes it much more simple than traditional two-way data binding and also reduces boilerplate code. All right, so when properties are updated, components are re-rendered. Now, like I said, by default, data flows only in one direction, so it flows from parent to child. Now, in some situations, you may need two-way data binding, and that's absolutely possible. You just need to use some kind of add-on. All right, so an example would be React Link, which is really easy to implement, and it will give you two-way data binding, much like AngularJS. All right, and we'll touch more on that later on. So, as far as the document object model, React creates its own version of it, and it's called the virtual DOM, or the virtual document object model. So what it does is it helps identify which parts have changed by comparing the new version with the previous version of the document object model. So kind of like a snapshot. It'll compare the two and make the necessary updates. All right, so in turn, it'll determine how to upload the browser's DOM more efficiently. And this, of course, makes for a faster application. All right, so let's take a look at what goes into loading and rendering a standard web page. So there's basically three basic steps. All right, so first we have the HTML and CSS gets parsed. All right, then it will create the render tree, and then finally it'll reflow and repaint or refresh. All right, now the first two things are extremely fast. All right, they happen almost instantly. The last thing, reflow, and repaint is basically when your UI changes and it displays the new version depending on whatever you did, however you changed the UI. All right, and that's what takes a while. So what React does, along with the virtual DOM, it significantly reduces the number of times that this last step has to happen. All right, and this of course makes it much faster. And the way it does that is it batches things together. So let's say normally if you wanted to have different things happen in your UI, let's say there was five changes. Normally you'd have to reflow and repaint 5 separate times, all right, which can get kind of slow. If you're using React, it can batch those 5 things together and put it through just one reflow and repaint. All right, so that obviously makes for a better application. And that's one of the huge benefits to using React.js. Okay, so React uses what's called isomorphic JavaScript, all right, not to be confused with the mathematical term isomorphism. All right, so what this means is that React.js can run on both the client or the server. Its JavaScript is capable of running on either. And we can narrow down this process to 3 steps. So first, the HTML will get rendered from the JavaScript app that's on the server. Second, the browser will load with full HTML. And third, JavaScript will load and bootstrap the application. All right, and we're going to take a look at both ways. Okay, so for the most part, we'll be running it on the client, but we will also be working a little bit with Node.js and running it on the server. All right, so one of the big selling points on React is that it's component-based development or component-based JavaScript. So if you've used other JavaScript libraries and frameworks like Angular or Knockout.js, then you've probably had some experience with component-based JavaScript. And what this is, it's essentially bundling functionality into smaller composable parts or components. And this in turn provides greater readability and it makes it easy for multiple developers and teams to be working all in the same project because you can break things up. All right, not only that, but it also gives your code reusability. And that's in the current application you're building as well as any other apps that you want to build that have similar functionality. You can just take that component and just insert it right into your new app. All right, and component-based development is the future of JavaScript and programming itself. All right, so it's all about bundling things down, reusing them, and having multiple developers and teams work on the same thing. All right, so React uses what's called JSX or JavaScript Syntax Extension. And this is what makes React so easy to use. All right, so it looks like either HTML or XML. It uses a tag syntax. And there is a couple differences, and we're going to go over that. We're going to have some videos that are dedicated purely to JSX. All right, so it defines a familiar syntax for defining tree structures with attributes. It isn't required, but it does make things easier. And we'll take a look at some code that compares the two. So code that does the same exact thing, one with JSX and one with standard JavaScript. All right, and we'll talk a lot more on JSX later on. So let's take a quick look at a really simple example. This is from the documentation, and it's about as simple as you're going to get. All right, so up here we have a variable called hello, and we're setting that equal to a new class, a new React class. All right, and for that we're going to use react.createClass. All right, then we're going to pass in an object with a render function. In the render function, we're going to return our HTML. All right, and this is where JSX comes into play. You can see we have a div tag, and inside it we have just a word hello, a string, and then we have this. Okay, so these are properties, and I created a property named name. All right, now down here is where we're going to call the actual render function. All right, so we're going to say react dom.render, and in here we have our HTML or JSX, and we have a tag called hello. Okay, so same thing as this variable up here. All right, and then you can see we have an attribute called name, and we're setting that to world. All right, so this attribute is this is where it's going to come from. All right, and then here we're just specifying where we want to put this, and we're using standard JavaScript document.getElementById. All right, so all we would have to do is create a div with the ID of container, and that's going to insert this hello component. All right, so you can see how it's all bundled in a simple component, and you could easily reuse this anywhere else. Not that you'd want to, but this is just a really simple example. All right, so those are the basics and fundamentals of React. Obviously there's more to it, and we'll get to that throughout the course. Hopefully you'll learn a lot from it, and I will see you in the next section.